Hello and welcome back. So my apologies yesterday for that square covering the video. I was able to troubleshoot it and figure out what was going on, and so it shouldn't happen again. So I apologize for that. I also want to let you know I'm doing a few things differently today. I took your feedback into consideration, which I really appreciate you giving me some honest, thoughtful feedback about how the first lecture went. So I'm doing a few things differently today. First of all, my apologies. I know I get really excited. I'm super passionate about art, so sometimes I just go, go, go. And I'll slow down a little bit, and I'll try to make my points a little more cohesive or clear, straightforward, and really lean into the things that are definitions. Another thing that I decided to do, and I know part of this is probably blocked by my face, is I decided to put the questions up in advance because a number of you said that it was difficult to go back and forth from the video to the prompts. So I'm going to go ahead and put them up in the beginning here. So if you want, you can pause this and jot these down. That way you know when I'm answering them what to make note of. Take notes in addition to this, but just to pay close attention to these so that way you can finish the online response after watching this video. So the first question, by the way, I'll read this out because it's probably cut off by my face. How did new materials influence architects and their work? The second question is, what does aesthetic mean? How do artists in the fin de siècle period use pure aesthetics compositionally? Okay, you should be able to read the rest of the questions. Go ahead and pause it here to write these down. So another thing that I'm going to do a little bit differently too today is if I say a word that should be a definition, I'll make sure to slow down and really clearly define it so I know that all of us are on the same page. For instance, like aesthetic. So today what we're talking about is first arts and crafts, which is a movement that then leads into Art Nouveau, and then the beginning of Expressionism. Then for the next chapter, chapter 5, I just picked two artists to really streamline it to sum up theories about new, pure color, and pure form, which we'll talk about, and how that also influences a lot of the modern art that happens in the 20th century. So first of all, let's revisit fin de siècle. Fin de siècle means end of century, and it was the turn of the century then from the 19th into the 20th century when there was this general sort of unease in society. Think about it this way. Things seemed to have out of nowhere just rapidly increased in technology as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So things started to just quickly change. People moved into cities, away from rural areas, and there was just a lot of innovation. And because of this idea of, if you're thinking about, 1899 turning into 1900, just like the song Party Like It's 1999 by Prince, there's this sort of pre-century tension. So you could take this into either two directions, which we'll talk about today. Fin de siècle either could mean there's this sort of tension or uneasiness about like a reaction to all of these changes, these fast-paced changes that is quickly changing society, the ability to travel quickly because of the steam engine, because of trains, buildings starting to build up quicker, faster, higher, that could scare people, right? That feels like what's going to happen next, right? I don't know if I'm prepared for what's going to come next. The other way that you could view this, and some people in a different camp took it as, wow, imagine the possibilities. Imagine what else we could do. So in response to fin de siècle, or this idea of things rapidly changing, artists like William Morris wanted society to sort of slow down and return to a more simpler time. So this is the start of what we call the arts and crafts period. And the reason it's called arts and crafts is because William Morris, as you can see here, wanted people to return to the handmade. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, one of the things that's possible because of mechanization is now you have like almost quickly produced affordable household goods, which sounds good for some, folks, but for John Ruskin, the critic, and William Morris, who were friends, they felt that that was a detriment to society, that speeding things up was an emphasis on convenience and leisure as opposed to the refinement of things that took time to make and were handmade. I mean, you can think about this today too, in terms of like someone who chooses to buy something from Walmart or Target, or whether someone goes to a local potter, like call up Jamie Berry and say, hey, I'd like my plates and my dishes and my mugs to be handmade, right? To kind of slow down. So there's a return to the handmade. So William Morris started the sort of arts and crafts movement to really emphasize that, the lost arts, medieval arts, the lost craft and craftspeople. So this is a detail of a wallpaper that he designed at the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century. And it's kind of a return to simpler things, a love of nature, these really nice interwoven designs, nature, flower, petals, leaves, really organic, as opposed to the kind of mass-produced geometric things that are happening as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So you can see this wallpaper is also, he wanted people to be able to kind of study those lost arts like stained glass, furniture making, as opposed to things that were more mechanically made and lost that individuality, that they were less ornate and they weren't as thoughtful in a way. So this starts the arts and crafts movement. Personally, like I live in a craftsman style home. You might be familiar with the arts and crafts movement in the United States because of craftsman bungalows that were really common from like the 1890s till about the 19-teens, 1920s. My house was built in 1921. So there's a lot of woodwork that abounds throughout the house, a lot of hand, applied texture and features like built-in units in the wall, cabinets, that sort of thing. So a return to craftsmanship and handwork as a way of responding to fin de siècle and the Industrial Revolution. So this is William Morris, arts and crafts. You can think about kind of like the craftsman house movement in the United States as a contemporary correlation, but a return to the handmade, an emphasis on natural work. This also influenced architecture at the same time. You kind of get the influence of craftsmen in this time period. Frank Lloyd Wright. This is a really innovative artist and architect, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who also, just like William Morris, was from the UK. He's from Scotland. He made work in the Glasgow School of Art, and this is actually the library in the Glasgow School of Art, which is in Scotland. He also taught there. And you can see just really beautiful forms and what he considered to kind of emphasize two things. That is the form, the way that something looks, but also the function. So you're not just thinking about a building as being kind of a space, but you're thinking about how that building looks. So similar to William Morris, there's a lot of emphasis on handmade details and sort of that arts and crafts tradition. But here's the thing. Mackintosh liked the idea of exploring what modernity could offer. So there's a uniqueness in materials, in making things uniquely 19th century, 20th century that couldn't have happened 100 years previous, and really exploiting the technology. So kind of a new use of materials and just a really beautiful sense of open space. So this is the interior of this library. He was really innovative. And so if you think about William Morris kind of looking back in response to modernity and response to how things were changing because of the Industrial Revolution, here Mackintosh and other architects were actually sort of embracing those as a positive. So you kind of think about how they used materials and were responding to the changes that were happening in society. So Mackintosh here is very, very innovative with his use of materials. And this is this kind of beautiful geometric abstraction. Look at the way the lights hang from the ceiling. So there are some things that are sort of functional that you need in a space like lights. Look at this verticality with the way that the lights hang. Also, these beams offer support so that the second story of the library can stand up. But there's also flourishes to them, like kind of these additional sections that hang down that add a decorative element. So you kind of got the form and you also have the function in terms of how he's using these interior spaces. This is a really innovative building that was very influential to later what becomes Art Nouveau. So this starts the arts and crafts movement, and later it kind of merges into what we call Art Nouveau that later happens in France and in other places. But this is Charles Rennie Mackintosh designing again in Glasgow, and this is the exterior on the left here of this willow tea room that was commissioned by a woman that wanted this tea house or place as a business. And a lot of times, the most innovative uses of architecture typically are commercial applications as opposed to private homes or public sphere like public buildings or governmental buildings. So we see kind of an innovative, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, a commercial space that's allowed in a way to kind of take more risks. Beautiful though. Let's take a look a little bit at what he does visually that's so different. So first of all, in thinking about design, you have general elements that you have to kind of play around with, and he had to fit this facade, aka the front of a building, into a set space, right? He was operating in a certain design space. Look at how different this is from the buildings next to it, but it still has kind of some similarities, so it fits in neatly. I love how this set of windows here is larger than this set of windows here, so it creates a certain harmony or sets up a visual look to it. It has this kind of repetition, almost like music, kind of creating this set of notes or harmony. And there's kind of notes, and then there's blank spaces in between to kind of create that harmony. There is in the front of the facade here, it's kind of like we could split this into halves, with the top half of the building up here being very vertical, and this part here, look at the windows, how they're very horizontal. So this bottom half is much more horizontal, and the second part up here, the top part, is much more vertical with these windows. And then there is some regularity and some repetition in how he designs out these windows. It's not a set kind of symmetry. It's a little bit asymmetrical because you've got this space here, which is different than the space here. Then on the outside, this looks very horizontal, but when we move in, or I'm sorry, it looks horizontal here from the outside, but when we move into the inside, look at how vertical those windows are. So again, there's this sort of harmony. And Charles Rennie Mackintosh, along with his wife, who did the wall murals and the wall painting, felt like there was no element that was too small to be part of the overall design, which is something that Frank Lloyd Wright in his work did as well. That is, it means that the walls, the chairs, so these chairs were part of Mackintosh's design as part of this team room experience. And you have the repetition in the windows. There's a sort of sense of verticality in the backs of these chairs that repeats in the windows that from the front look very, very horizontal, but on the inside, much more vertical. And look at how much light they let in. So this is really utilizing new materials to strengthen visual aspects, doing something completely new and innovative. So William Morris, Charles Rennie Mackintosh are both examples of arts and crafts. Arts and crafts slowly, starts to become different variations in different locations, and it also starts to blend in what is called in France Art Nouveau. What is the definition of Art Nouveau? Well, it's sort of like post-impressionism. It's very self-explanatory. Art Nouveau literally means the new art. And what artists were trying to do is make something new, basically in response to fin de siècle, or that turn of that century, right? The slowing down of society because things were kind of moving too quickly. I also want you to define aesthetics. What does aesthetic mean? Aesthetics quite simply just means beauty. So making something appear beautiful. Aesthetics means to make art really look pleasing to the eye, visually interesting. So aesthetics is you have your idea, but how your idea gets manifested visually is as important as the subject matter. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at this composition. So this is Aubrey Beardsley Salome with the head of John the Baptist. What I want you to do is see what you notice first. Where is your eye drawn in this composition? And I'll have you pause it and answer this question. And so I'm curious, in terms of aesthetics, where you look first. Now imagine some of you might have looked here first with the head of Salome, facing eye to eye with the head of John the Baptist. But I imagine the majority of the class actually noticed these elements first. That is the decorative elements. That is aesthetics. That is the artist, Aubrey Beardsley, who is one of the first Art Nouveau artists and probably one of the best known Art Nouveau artists, really playing around with the way that the image looks. Kind of art for art's sake, just like Whistler would say. It's about the beauty. It's about the aesthetic experience. And I think it, makes us look at the art a certain way, and it changes the focus as we start to look at this. It's really about the two figures, but they become almost subordinate to the display of how much black is in this composition, how much white is in this section, a nice contrast. Now, one thing about this is India ink and watercolor on paper. It's not real big, about 5 by 10, about that size. Has anyone worked with ink before? India ink and a brush? And you might know what some of the drawbacks are of working with India ink. Now, it creates a beautiful black line and contrast. It gets a really great difference between white and black, but it's also difficult to work with because one of the drawbacks is if you make a mistake and you get an ink splotch somewhere, you just have to go with it because you can't erase it. So here we see Aubrey Beardsley really controlling the ink to great mastery. It's just like a really acute technical ability that he's using with a thin line and then some shapes that are much, much larger. A lot of organic. We see that with Art Nouveau. A lot of curvilinear, a lot of organic, flowery types of forms. What's the content here? When I say Salome with the head of John the Baptist, well, this is based on a Oscar Wilde play. Aubrey Beardsley was really interested in Oscar Wilde's writings and Edgar Allan Poe as well, just like the symbolist artists were. And he drew this image related to an Oscar Wilde play that was based on Salome, the biblical Salome, who asks for the head of John the Baptist from King Herod, which King Herod obliges. And you can see, the tendrils of the hair create this organic shape. The blood dripping down here creates this kind of curvilinear shape. Just a lot of really interesting curvilinear forms. The tendrils and the hair that's kind of branching out from the head of Salome almost looks like Medusa or something. Really, really beautiful use of space. This is the start of Art Nouveau, a new art, trying to do something innovative and really looking at aesthetics. The idea of making something look pleasing and beautiful first, before second you notice the subject matter and what the piece is about. Another really famous Art Nouveau artist is Alphonse Marie Mucha, and this piece here, in the book they show a sculpture by Mucha, which I think is beautiful, but I think that it's a better explanation to show a print, a graphic work by Alphonse Mucha, because he's better known for that. So this is a print that was able to be mass produced. Hey, that's using the qualities of the Industrial Revolution to an artist's effect. This was a piece that could also be kind of used as a zodiac horoscope calendar. You'll notice here at the bottom. And it's called Le Plume, the Zodiac. And this is just one part of the Zodiac here. And it pictures, the subject matter is Sarah Bernhardt. Sarah Bernhardt, remember, is that French actress that Nadar, the photographer, took a photograph of in the chapter where we talked about early photography, kind of focusing on the celebrity. Sarah Bernhardt was a friend of Mucha's, and also, so this was paid for, commissioned by Sarah Bernhardt, and also, inspired by her, which is kind of cool. So that's Nadar's photograph of Sarah Bernhardt. Beautiful image, really interesting because, it looks realistic in sections. Like here, it's a portrait, but then the hair becomes really decorative and kind of mimics the natural forms like the leaves and the greenery in the background. And then also we have this really interesting circle. What does that look like? Kind of looks like a halo or an icon in icon paintings or illuminated manuscripts. So this is Mucha looking back at medieval art, illuminated manuscripts, just like William Morris with the arts and crafts movement looked back towards the Middle Ages. And remember, the Renaissance artists wanted to negate what happened in the Middle Ages. They literally called it the Dark Ages. But here artists are saying in the late 19th century, early 20th century, what's wrong with the Dark Ages? Let's go back to a simpler time, right? It's kind of interesting. Another really famous, well-known Art Nouveau artist is Gustav Klimt. He is an Austrian artist. He's working in Vienna. This is an interesting piece here. He did mosaic style murals, but he had a hard time kind of selling them. Not a lot of commercial businesses wanted these types of murals or mosaics in their facility. So instead, he did to offset that, to create a better income. He also created portraits. So this is a portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And if you hold up your thumb and block the face, it almost becomes an abstract painting. That's the realistic part. The rest of it is very abstracted and not as representational. Is much more about aesthetics. It's about a beautiful, pleasing experience, and it's not necessarily the entire thing representational. What was Gustav Klimt inspired by? Well, he was really interested in Byzantine mosaics. So if you think about the Byzantine was during the Middle Ages, right? If you think about the Roman Empire and the eastern part in Byzantium, which becomes Constantinople, you have beautiful mosaics like this where there are some kind of naturalistic elements that are shaded, like here, surrounded by fields of gold, which is essentially what Gustav Klimt was doing as well. So again, he's looking back. He's looking back art historically to kind of create a new art, one that's really based on aesthetics. And again, if you hold up your thumb and block the faces, this isn't representational anymore. If you block the faces, it really is like an abstract composition. It's more beauty for beauty's sake or art for art's sake, and it's more about the formal elements. And when I say formal elements, I mean line and shape and color and texture and value, and not as much about representing a larger slice of reality, an illusionistic space. And actually, if you think about these, what is this? This is a kiss. This is a moment embrace between two figures. Auguste Rodin also had that piece, a sculpture of a kiss. You saw the Camille Claudel's piece that was like the waltz, or actually you saw a piece of it because there was a big damn black box in front of it. You saw part of it, but it kind of reminds me of this as well, where you've got the two figures here mostly become this big, huge mass. So the two figures kind of become one figure, but there's a distinction in how Gustav Klimt treats the figures. Here we kind of see a more masculine, rectilinear use of squares and rectangles. And then here with the female form, you see more circles and kind of flowery shapes to distinguish the two figures, which I think is beautiful. It's really interesting. But Gustav Klimt is inspired by these Byzantine mosaics, which would be huge mosaics made of teeny tiny glass tiles to fill in these spaces architecturally inside of a church. So Gustav Klimt was part of a movement called the Vienna Secessionists. And the reason why they were called the Vienna Secessionists is because there was a more conservative group of artists, a society of artists, kind of like the French Royal Academy in France or the Royal Academy in England. And what they did is they separated out from that Vienna group because they felt like it was too stifling to their creative. They basically said, we don't want to play by your rules, we're going to play by our own rules, and we're going to start our own group. So this was their first exhibition. They had an exhibition that was exploring Art Nouveau in Austria, the Vienna Secessionists, and they had a publication that they called Ver Sacrum, which you can see here is also labeled on the building, and this means sacred spring. And then also at the top here, there's this really beautiful inscription on this building designed by Joseph Maria Albrecht. And this phrase is their group's motto, and it's in gold letters above the entrance. You can think about a lot of times buildings, whether it's the Pantheon or even the Lion building on Lion campus, will have an inscription, right? It'll have a name written on it. It'll say like a phrase in Latin or something. And this is the group's motto, and appears in gold letters. It says, Der seid ihr Kunst, der Kunst ihr Freiheit, which means to every age it's art. To art, it's freedom. And I love that. So it's basically saying that anything is possible in art, and we can experience freedom through the art that we create. Which I love that. I think it's beautiful. If you think about this building as architecture, where they had their exhibition inside of this as part of an expo, they have some Greek elements, right? Kind of looks like the front of a Greek temple. But instead of a pediment here, where normally you'd have this kind of triangle, think about the Pantheon or the Parthenon, you'd normally have a triangular pediment here and then columns like this all the way in the front. But instead, the front is very, very plain. The columns, in a way, have been pushed to the edges. And instead of a pediment, we have this square frame with this beautiful gold-leafed sphere made of flowers at the top. So it's this new kind of architecture, a new visual form based on aesthetics, based on arts and crafts, based on Arts Nouveau, and even looks like an Art Nouveau composition. Look at these little sprouting elements here, these kind of filigrees here that look like trees blooming, and the gold that's been applied to it. Really, really beautiful. I love how it frames the door, and there's some figures that are carved in there as well. You have some decoration up here. Really interesting design for this building as a way of highlighting, kind of setting up an expectation of what you're going to see inside. I think it's saying when you come inside, you're not going to see a normal art exhibition. And it's kind of a sneak peek, a preview of the style of art that you're going to see on the inside. So this was the Vienna Secessionists. This was their exhibition space. And Gustav Klimt and others were really pushing against what was going on at the time. You can think about how this manifests itself differently in other countries as well. This is an example of American Art Nouveau. Louis Comfort Tiffany. Tiffany lamps, Tiffany vases, Tiffany stained glass becomes really prominent, really important, really sought after in the United States. A decorative art, a very beautiful decorative art. But I love this. So it's something that's functional, but it's something that's very beautiful as well. So it has a purpose, but it's also exploring its aesthetics. And I love this really simple base at the bottom, and then the way which this is a tree kind of take roots. Here's the roots here, here's the trunk of the tree, and then here is the blossom and the foliage. And when this is illuminated with a bulb, then you can see shadows and light interplay, responding to the room that it sits in. So really, really beautiful. And this is another variation of Art Nouveau happening as a decorative art in the United States. Shifting gears, not necessarily talking about Art Nouveau. This is a really unique artist and architect, Antoni Gaudi. It's one of those types of art, just like when we looked at Auguste Rodin, it's like work that it's hard to place when it was made. It could have been made a really, really long time ago, or it could have been made yesterday. It just seems both ancient and contemporary at the same time. So Antoni Gaudi was really interested in changing things and using materials and the new kind of modern building techniques like metal fabrication, sheets of metal, concrete, and plaster as using new technologies to his advantage to be able to make this when it wouldn't have been possible any other time. But he truly has a unique, singular vision. There's no other architect that really came before him or after that's doing this. So it's hard to define it. It's hard to neatly put it into a art movement or an architectural movement. This is Gaudi. This is in Barcelona, Spain. It's on my bucket list. I haven't been there, but I want to go there. I'm jealous if you have been there. This is an amazing building. It's called the Church of the Sagrada Familia, which means the Holy Family. And so in Barcelona, this started first as a more simple Gothic church that someone else started in kind of the Gothic tradition. And then Gaudí finished it, or actually started to finish it, is still not done. Even till this day, they've been working on it ever since. But Gaudí and others were starting to say, you know, we need to look back at architecture and not at the architecture now, to try to do something new, to do something different. So it's what we call Gothic revival. And a bit about Gothic architecture. So during the Renaissance, those Renaissance artists and architects looked back at what came before them, and there was either Romanesque churches, or there was, which means they looked Roman, or there was Gothic churches. And they thought the Gothic churches, with their big, tall, pointy, vertical spires, were ugly, were hideous. And so they even nicknamed them Gothic because they thought they were so ugly that maybe Goths made them, which isn't true. Medieval Christians made them in like the 12th and the 13th century. And so Gaudí and others said, no, these are beautiful. Let's recreate the kind of handwork, the mastery that it took to create these. But I think the true masterpiece of this is seeing what's inside. This is the view inside of the nave looking up into those spires, and it's just mind-blowing. This is like a CG movie. It looks otherworldly. It looks like special effects, but this is over 100 years old, and it's amazing. He's using new technologies to be able to build things that couldn't have been built before. It kind of looks like Islamic architecture and Gothic architecture at the same time, because he was basing it on the muqarnas that are in Islamic mosques that are sort of like these tessellated forms that kind of get smaller and smaller and smaller, that look like stalactites and stalagmites, right? And it's just an amazing triumph of building and also visual aspects. And like I said, he never finished this. So this was one of his first commissions. This is one of the first pieces that he ever starts in 1883, and he dies in 1926, and he still was not finished with it. So he was working on this for about 40 years, and still to this day, they're trying to complete and finish. Probably not in my lifetime, but probably in y'all's lifetime, you'll be able to see this building finished. You can see that there's still construction going on over here to complete Antoni Gaudí's original vision, right? Just amazing to think about. This is another one of his masterpieces. This is Gaudí's Casa Millet, which is also in Barcelona. It is an apartment building. This is using cast concrete, cement, and stone carving, as well as stained glass windows and metal fabrication. So there's some metal fabrication here. This looks very Art Nouveau. You can also see he's kind of mimicking some of those shapes. These are almost like sculptures, and that has a precedent also in Islamic architecture. These spires that are at the top kind of look like the spires that are at the top of Sagrada Familia. But what I love about this is typically the front of a building would be just that, a front of a building, and you can think about things becoming a 90-degree angle. He doesn't do that. It's almost like one long facade instead of a 90-degree angle. So instead of it, going into space like this, oops, I'll draw over here. Instead of a building going back into space like this, and this is the front, and this is the side. Essentially what he's done is he's eliminated this, and he's just fit the form into that space. So here's the left street, here's the right street, and it becomes one long elongated form, which is very, very beautiful. I love the undulating curves that are here, the sense of both verticality and horizontal quality of this. And it looks cave-like. It looks like you're inside of a shell or something. And again, the book only shows the outside. I think the inside is even more beautiful than the outside. It feels like you're inside of a kaleidoscope or a shell. Beautiful forms. And you can see there's some tradition in it as well. I mean, this looks like Greek or Roman arches and columns. Woodworking is common in churches, but he's able to use new technologies to be able to bend and manipulate that wood so they're curving and follow the curve of the building itself. This looks like how a pinwheel or a shell, spirals out. Really, really beautiful. This is still an apartment. This would be just like a dream to live in this, right? But it's also a museum, so you can tour the first floor, and the upper floors are still apartments. Just an amazing space in Barcelona. Really great use of space. And I think what he's doing with materials, again, is thinking about new ways of encapsulating space. Architecture is just that. Architecture is basically like a shelter for us, but it doesn't just have to always fit into the same conventions. And what he's doing is saying, what's the benefit of being in this place? Thinking about the space around you, but also thinking about the view and thinking about how color and light just really would be an amazing experience to go through this building, but also to live in this building. It would change your perspective. Another Art Nouveau architect is the very famous Belgian architect Victor Horta, really synonymous with Art Nouveau. And similar to Mackintosh, his idea is that there's kind of no element that's too small to design. So it's kind of hidden a little bit, but you can see that there is this hanging lamp. So he is a Belgian Flemish architect. You can see these columns start as kind of traditional columns, but then they have these tendrils that radiate out, that connect the floor to the ceiling. You kind of think about it, there's only like a certain amount of elements that you can put in a building. You got the roof, you got the floor, you got the walls. But then the space, what can you do with that space to create a new effect, a new environment, a new experience? And this is where Victor Horta, just like a 2D artist like Mucha or Beardsley, is using the aesthetic experience to create a sense of beauty and something that's pleasing to the eye when you walk through this building. So, if you think about, like, you got stairs, you got wall, you got ceiling, boring. That's always going to be the case. But look what he does with the stairs and how they cascade out, like pouring out. The floor has these repeating spiral shapes, and on the wall as well. He felt like Mackintosh did as well. It's like you ornament the building, you decorate the building. Even something as simple as a railing and a stair. Well, here, instead of just having vertical elements, there's also these curvilinear forms as well. Really beautiful, interesting thing. And in Brussels, one of the things that I want to kind of point out is think about when things were made. So this is at the turn of the century, 19th century to the 20th century. And in Brussels, if you think about it, like, if you're in Batesville, if you're in Little Rock, there's only a certain amount of places in a downtown that you can add buildings. Usually the downtown's already set. So one thing you could do is tear a building down, put a new building there, or maybe there was never a building in that space. And so there's kind of a limited amount of spaces that you can put new structures. So architects have to kind of work with the parameters they're given. And so some cities could only accommodate a few new buildings or new construction or new things that would be going up if someone's paying for something to be made. So a place like Brussels had, a certain amount of homes or buildings downtown that were being built in that time period, and then boom, styles change. Art Nouveau is not common anymore. Think about it like if anyone's been to Miami, Florida before, Art Deco was really popular in like the 1920s, and Art Deco relates to Art Nouveau, manifests itself in the United States. If things would have been built in Miami 50 years earlier or 50 years later, you wouldn't have all of that Art Deco architecture. You'd have a different style of buildings. So it really depends on what's popular and what you're able to experiment with during that time. Same as if, you're thinking about, a commission of like the way a church is built. When the church is built, it's going to be built in a certain kind of style. And one of the things I'd like to take students to Latvia next summer. Latvia in Riga, actually, there was a lot of construction that was happening between 1890 and 1905. And so they have the world's largest concentration of Art Nouveau buildings in the world. So if you go with me on that trip in Riga, you'll be able to walk through downtown and we'll point out all of these amazing, beautiful Art Nouveau buildings that have amazing three-dimensional Art Nouveau, like decorative ornamentation on them. Some of them have like gargoyle faces or cat faces on them, curvilinear forms. They're just beautiful. They're amazing. This is another example of kind of a hard to define artist. So this is kind of leading into what we later called Expressionism. So Expressionism wasn't a thing yet, But we have artists like Munch and this very famous image, the Scream, that then influence kind of what come after it. So Munch is a Scandinavian artist. He's from Oslo, Norway. He lives in Munich for a little while. He also lived in Paris for a little while. It seems like everything around the turn of the century is kind of happening in Paris. It's a big art capital and an art market there. What's interesting, though, he was part of a society. He exhibited around other artists like Van Gogh and Gauguin. You can kind of see that influence in his work. This kind of looks like Gauguin in ways. It kind of looks like Van Gogh. But he was also trying to push and do something different. But he had a retrospective. His reputation got so big that he was invited to have an exhibition of work in Berlin. And he showed this painting and others. And that society that invited him to have this big, huge retrospective of all of his paintings actually closed the show after 1 week instead of for months that it was promised to be, because they thought it was so controversial. The public hated it so much, they took it down. Which is so ironic, because this becomes one of the most famous paintings of all time. And this is now in a museum in Oslo. And this painting and another variation of it as well had been stolen. This is really interesting. This painting, he did other variations of it, but a very iconic painting. And let me ask you this. What is this painting about? What does this painting mean? Well, one of the entrance points to this is you can always look at a title. A title is going to tell you a lot. And in this case, the title is The Scream. So a lot of people think it's about the guy screaming. That's not really what's going on, or at least that's not what Munch said. Munch described an experience of walking on a bridge with his friends and looking at the sky, and he believed that it appeared as if it had been painted red, which you see he did here, and that there was this loud scream that he heard nature producing, and it scared the shit out of him. And it was this idea of being overwhelmed by this great feeling of anxiety. So the person's not screaming, the landscape is screaming. And it's this resistance, it's this sort of social anxiety about being around other people and being around the modern city and feeling a sense of both together with other people, but also isolated from them. And I think he really, increases that feeling of vulnerability and separation and isolation, because we don't know if these figures here are friend or foe, if they're walking towards him or if they're walking away from him. And this landscape, which is like really weird looking, I mean, there's parts here that kind of make sense, like the water and some ships on the water, but what's this? And what's this form here? It's really, really weird, and it looks scary and foreboding, but we can also see the kind of the curvilinear Art Nouveau influence as well. So it's part influenced by post-impressionists like Gauguin and Van Gogh, but it also is a little bit Art Nouveau and a little just like uniquely Edvard Munch, which we can see in this as well. He had this larger series of work that he called frieze of life, meaning slices of life, or cross sections of living. And he said that they were dedicated to the central themes in life of love, sexual anxiety, and death, which we really see here. I mean, it's like, okay, where do you see love? All right, well, maybe these two figures right here that are dancing, okay? But this guy, I mean, he already kind of looks dead. He looks like a zombie. Sexual anxiety, hello, look at this. Like, whoa, that's just weird. Like, this guy's definitely creeping on this woman. She's kind of like taken aback by it. But really interesting way of rendering things that don't seem like this is an altogether pleasing arrangement. This is the sunset back here. Here's the horizon. And this creates almost like this capital I, or also almost looks like, a figure back here. Really interesting. Probably one of the best things, not the best things, probably one of the most interesting things that Munch did, though, is he really created an interest in printmaking and becomes one of the greatest printmakers of the 20th century. And he creates what's known as a printmaking revival, where for the longest time, artists hadn't been doing a lot of woodcut or prints. And here he's doing a woodcut that's a combination print with a lithograph. Remember, we talked about the lithographs of Toulouse-Lautrec. And here he's combining a woodcut with a lithograph. Really, really beautiful. print here. And what's kind of cool about the way that Munch used woodcut, which is so different than the way that other artists did it, was he would take a block and obviously carve it like the Japanese printmakers would, or the earlier printmakers like Dürer, but then he would literally cut the block apart into sections. So if he like cut out the background, cut out a head, cut out the figure, and then he could ink those all up independently, put them back together on the press, put a piece of paper on top, run it through to create this multiple color print out of one block, which was really, really brilliant and innovative. So he was really successful in contributing to this huge printmaking revival and making woodcuts kind of like cool again, and like people wanted to do more printmaking. Another artist, one of my favorite artists, and specifically from this period, that's kind of easing into this idea later of what we call expressionism, but isn't quite there yet, is this artist James Ensor. James Ensor is a Flemish artist. He's from Belgium. He's a Belgian artist. And he was originally in this group of artists called Leasor, which is this, it was a kind of a quasi-international group. One of the things to kind of keep in mind at this time was James Ensor and others were really proud about their heritage and the idea that Belgium was kind of newly independent and different and distinct from its earlier Dutch control by the Dutch government. And so he looked back at kind of the history of Belgium and took that kind of pride and that nationality to heart. And you can really see it in his artwork as well. He was originally in this group called Leasor that showed their work together, but they also showed artists like Monet and Manet and Seurat. And they even brought the painting a few years after it was created, Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte that we looked at before, the huge painting, the Sunday Afternoon on that island in Paris. They brought that to exhibit alongside other artists. But he pushed kind of too hard. He didn't like what they were doing ultimately, and he started his own group called the 20, which ironically, even though he wanted it to be all Belgian artists, became international artists, and they showed in other places. They showed in Belgium. And ultimately, he even got too progressive for that group. They took a vote about kicking him out of this own group that he started, and his vote was the deciding vote to keep him. And eventually he decided to leave anyways because he didn't like that they were letting other international artists show and they were showing in other places. He just wanted to make his artwork for a Belgian audience because he was really proud about his nationality. And he's self-fashioning here. This is a portrait of the artist, aka a self-portrait of the artist surrounded by masks. So one of the things that's really important to know about James Ensor is he was sort of a hermit. He lived a kind of solitary lifestyle, and he lived with his mom. He lived with his family, even after he was selling his paintings and had some notoriety. And their house, his Flemish mother and their relatives kept a souvenir shop to sell to tourists things like masks and shells and different kind of little toys and trinkets that people could buy. So here we see basically like a person, a self-portrait of the things that he's surrounded with, these masks. And some of them look like faces, and some of them look hauntingly like they have eyes in them, and they're just the shell of the person or the mask themselves. And here he is, also donning a mask, as it were, because he's putting on a different persona. And what persona or personality is that? But another artist, and that is the great Flemish master Peter Paul Rubens, who was very, very famous as a Flemish artist in the 17th century, who did a lot of church commissions and a lot of huge monumental paintings. And James Ensor saw himself in that tradition and kind of against the ideas of modern society and thinking society was kind of grotesque. His thickly applied paint kind of reminds me of Van Gogh, but because of the structure of it, it's doing something a little bit different, which becomes really popular with Expressionism and later German Expressionism. A lot of people feel like he did this piece in particular in response to Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Grande Jatte, because it had just been exhibited and he made a piece about the same scale. This one's a little bit larger, 8.5 feet by 12.5 feet, instead of Seurat's painting, which is like 7 feet by 10 feet that we can see here, he didn't like Seurat. He was saying Seurat is too worried about the middle class and the bourgeoisie society and pleasing other people. James Ensor was pissed off at other people. He didn't like the middle class. He didn't like the bourgeoisie. So he's responding to Seurat's work. He's kind of one-upping him, and he's riffing off of that painting. And this is huge in scale. This painting was so controversial in its day that it was never exhibited until 1929. So 40 years after it was created, it actually finally gets exhibited because it was way ahead of its time. It was really, really shocking. What's the iconography in here? Let's unpack this a little bit. So you can see that here is the Pope. So this is sacrilegious. This is like, and he's kind of leaning back, pointing back, and who's he pointing to? Christ back here, riding into Brussels, and it says "Viva la sociale," like "Viva the society," and you can see his faces are like those grotesque masks. Now, some of the real faces look grotesque, like characters, and others are actual masks. Basically, what he's saying is when Christ returns, instead of going to Jerusalem, if he returns to Brussels, because he's nationalistic, people won't recognize him. It'll be more about the spectacle of society celebrating themselves as opposed to the return of Christ riding into Brussels on a donkey. So this is really interesting. He's basically saying if Christ came today, we wouldn't recognize him. We would celebrate ourselves, right? So I think this is a really contemporary critique about modern society. This is on the scale of Grand Jeté, and it's in response to that painting as well, which I think is really, really interesting. And it inspires artists later in German Expressionism. This painting isn't in the book, but I wanted to show this. I think it's a really interesting, really beautiful one. If you ever have an opportunity to go to Belgium, there's a museum there, the Royal Museum of Brussels, which actually one of my prints is in their permanent collection, like whoa, because I did a residency in Belgium and made prints, and then that museum collected all of the prints that were created during that stay or that residency. But Brussels, the museum, is an amazing museum, and inside of it, they have an entire section, entire wing of their museum dedicated to James Ensor's work because he was a nationalistic kind of dude, and because he didn't really like to leave Belgium and his works were shocking, most of them stayed in Belgium. So if you want to see a James Ensor painting, you kind of have to go to Brussels to see him. And this is influential to what comes after it as well. I just wanted to mention how later in German Expressionism that this actually, you can see this painting at the Getty in LA. So if you go to LA, you can see this one. But a lot of his paintings like this one are actually in Brussels. For the next chapter, chapter 5, what I want to do is I'm just going to talk about two artists. I think that we can really look at the overall body of work by two artists during this period to kind of sum up what's going on in this chapter. Chapter 5 called The New Century, Experiments in Color and Form. And so I want to take this one step further and say pure color and pure form. And we'll get into that. We'll sort of unpack that with these two artists, Henri Matisse, very, very famous artist, and then also Constantine Brancusi. A lot of times people will say that Picasso is probably the most important or most well-known artist of the 20th century. You could not have Picasso, as I mentioned before, if it were not for Paul Cézanne. But you could also not have Picasso if it weren't for Henri Matisse. And a lot of things that Picasso did, Matisse did them first. I kind of like to think about it as like Matisse and Picasso are like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. Sure, the Beatles did it first, but a lot of times what the Rolling Stones would do with their albums is try to one-up and quote the Beatles and take it to that next step. And that's what Matisse and Picasso did. And Picasso a lot of times kind of won out and had more famous work or more popular work or was bigger celebrity, but oftentimes Matisse beat him to the punch and did it first. So we'll see that today. One of the things, when Matisse first had one of his first exhibitions and gets a wider audience known to the public, he has an exhibition with another group of artists inspired by Van Gogh and others. And a critic came to that show and called their paintings so hideous and garish that it looked like they were wild beasts. The paintings themselves, the artists themselves were wild beasts. That's what the word fauvism means. Fauve literally means wild beast. So Matisse and others were doing things with color that just were really, really shocking. This work is, you can see this on page 93, is titled Lux Calm et Volupte, which means luxury, calm, and pleasure, and it's based on a poem by Charles Baudelaire. And I'll just read a section because I think it's a really beautiful poem. He says, this is the second stanza, in the land that's akin to thee, where the suns which rise in the watery skies weave soft spells over my sight, as they false eyes do when they flicker through their tears with a dim, strange light. There all is beauty and symmetry, pleasure and calm and luxury. And he keeps repeating that same line throughout different stanzas, pleasure and calm and luxury. So he's quoting the poem by Charles Baudelaire, and I think he's like beautifully illustrating as well. You can see he's influenced by Cézanne as well, with broken color, where color doesn't necessarily make sense. I love the sky. It's like a rainbow. It's so beautiful and prismatic. The water as well. Parts of it are blue, but part of it doesn't make any sense. The landscape is red. You know, the sky isn't just blue. The water isn't just blue. The grass isn't green. It's a really interesting juxtaposition. And here we see nature. Here we see beauty, aesthetics, exploring the visual qualities of the form. And Matisse is doing what the symbolists did, and Gauguin with that one piece with the red background, and that is separating out color from its expected, use of local color, or that a color always means one thing, like trees have to be green, or the water or the sky has to be blue. Instead, he's using pure color, pure dabs of color, pure color to express nothing but the joy of color. So I think it's just really beautiful. And it makes you happy, and it gives you this sense of calm and pleasure and looking at it. This is a theme that Matisse repeats consistently in his work, is just pure, beautiful color, but art that is about the aesthetic experience as well. Art that is using arbitrary color, where color doesn't have to fit into the expectation of what you're seeing. This was a place that he went, so Matisse is a French artist, works in Paris, but he lived for a little while in the south of France, in Collier, which is a Mediterranean port city, and very beautiful color. So for me personally, I grew up in Michigan. If you've ever been to Michigan or like Seattle or London, it's dreary. The sky tends to be gray, not as colorful, but as the further south you go and the closer you get to the equator and the Mediterranean and other places, that color looks more bold, more prismatic. And that's why Gauguin's work in Tahiti was much more colorful than it was when he was in Paris. Or other artists, can compare something being northern light versus southern light. And so this is a theme that he repeats quite a bit in his work as well. The open window. And sorry, the title got cut off here, but this is Henri Matisse in 1905. And this painting is called The Open Window, because a lot of times he would do paintings of windows, kind of like looking out into the scene. So it's kind of a landscape painting, but it's an interior space at the same time, which I think is really interesting juxtaposition. And beautiful color, magentas, greens, pink, orange. I love these up here. To me, these look like little mini compositions, like little Rothko paintings. These look like abstract paintings. It just is really giving a lot of freedom to not worrying if this looks exactly like a boat in a landscape with surrounded by trees. And what he did too is kind of leave empty patches of the canvas or the white, so the color would even pop even more. And he didn't have to fill the canvas entirely, and used really rough open brushstrokes where he didn't feel like it had to blend. Really interesting aesthetic experience, trying to make pleasing to the eye compositions. Another thing that he did was, similar to Seurat, he really thought about the science of color and thought about color theory and color harmony. If you look at a color wheel Red is opposite green, orange is opposite blue, yellow is opposite violet, and that creates a certain color harmony. There's also something called a split complement, where instead of comparing red and green, which is kind of like Christmas, right, or like maybe a really typical juxtaposition of colors, instead you would do red and the two colors on either side of green, like yellow green or reddish blue, and so it creates a more interesting juxtaposition of colors and creates this split complement. This is a portrait of his wife, Henri Matisse's wife, and it's also nicknamed the Green Line because of this really bold line that stands out in the center of the face. When you look at this, it's really exploring the visual, the formal aspects, like this aesthetic experience, beauty for beauty's sake. But I think if you squint at it, and do me a favor, just kind of squint at this for a minute, it still looks somewhat representational. The eyes, the nose, the mouth still give the sense of the quality of the person that we're looking at. And actually, if we subtract out the color and squint at this, it still looks pretty realistic, pretty representational, but color is kind of like a coating on the painting that doesn't necessarily have to make sense. When he was looking at his wife, her hair wasn't bluish purple. She wasn't, one of the Simpsons, Marge Simpson with the purple hair, with the blue hair and the yellow skin. One side of her face, peach, green here, it doesn't really make sense. But if you squint at it and you look at the value here, it does still kind of look dimensional and representational. So he's finding a freedom in color, which I think is beautiful. This is also one of his masterpieces. And this is an interesting piece because he made this and he kind of returns to a lot of the themes. And this is called Le Bonheur de Vivre, which means the joy of life. And again, remember, think about it. He's using pure color as this really positive aesthetic experience to produce a sense of joy, pleasing. He actually was in Carrier when he made this. It's a landscape painting that kind of makes sense for where he was, but the color doesn't really make sense. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have this kind of illusionistic sense of space. It's more about the scene and what's going on here. This is like post-pandemic. Everyone's just going to be going buck wild out in the wild, getting naked and just having fun, right? Like, man, we can finally get together and party again and just go buck wild. I don't know, maybe not. You got the person over here playing two flutes at once. People just sunbathing down here. They're dancing. This is just the joy of life, the best parts of life post-pandemic. Being able to just go out there and get jiggy with it, right? And mostly female forms, so he's kind of making this connection between beauty and the female form and nature and nudity, kind of the essence, the not being restricted by the confines of modern life and wearing clothes, but just kind of this idyllic utopian society of just returning to simpler kind of essence of life. This, let me go back here. This is something he returns to this painting quite a bit. Look at this figure right here. We'll see this figure again. Look at this circle of figures here. We'll see those figures again. He keeps returning back to this same painting. This is also an interesting painting because, like I said, he kind of got to these ideas before Picasso did. And this was bought by a famous collector, Gertrude Stein, who then introduced Matisse's work to Picasso, who saw this painting at her apartment. And they became frenemies in a way. They became rivals. They wanted to keep one-upping each other. And so when Picasso saw this, he wanted to really outdo this painting. And you can see some of those ideas in the works of Picasso, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. So see this form right here. And then also we'll see this again here. This is that same form, but just like Picasso later, Matisse and his friends began to collect art objects from Africa. Think about, colonialism was happening at the time, but he actually visited Africa. He started to collect objects, and his work was inspired by what he said was primitivism, just like Gauguin, and based on African forms. So this looks kind of like an African sculpture, but it's based on that same form right here. And we see it again here. And this is actually a motif that he returns to a lot throughout his life. Later in life, he becomes disabled, and he's only able to make collages. He can't make huge paintings anymore. He's in a wheelchair, and he returns to this idea of blue nudes by doing these paper cutout collages. But you can see this odalisque, which is like this female reclining nude that we see throughout our history. And you can see the African influence. It almost looks like she's wearing an African mask. And the way that her form is kind of jutting out into more abstract elements, it's based on African art and sculptures and masks that he would have been seeing and others would have been seeing for the very first time. That people are starting to study those, first in natural history museums, and then later they start to become part of art museums. Picasso also collected art objects, and we can see in some of his paintings that he used African masks as well. Matisse beat him to the punch, though. Really interesting. And this painting is called Blue Nude, Memory of Biskra. And Biskra is a town in North Africa that's sort of an oasis in the middle of the desert, and he had actually visited it. And so he did this figure from memory, and you can kind of even see him sketching out and kind of making the form, remaking the form from his memory of going to Africa, but also from memory of these two earlier artworks, which I think is really, really interesting. This is the last piece that we're going to talk about by Matisse, and this is after Fauvism. Matisse is definitely doing his own thing at this point. He's not worried about fitting into a group or worried about what other people are doing. This is modernism on a much bigger scale, and so he's kind of refining his ideas, and I think this is one of his masterpieces. He had a patron that was from Moscow. So a lot of Matisse's really, some of his most signature important pieces are in museums in Russia. And this one in particular is in one of the most important museums in the world, and also the most important museum in Russia, and that's the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And it's a really interesting piece for a couple of different reasons. Now, think about what art typically is. There are only so many things you can make art about. And what are some of the most traditional things to make art about is landscape, still life, and portraits. And this is all three of those things, but not in the old way, in a brand new way, exploring pure form instead of representational. Instead of representational, I see it as instead of an illusion, it's basically just referencing those things. It's like a shorthand, it's like a summation, an abstract version of those. Where's the landscape? Well, you could either see this as a window here, am I right? Or it could be a painting of a landscape on the wall, because this sort of looks like a frame here. This could be a painting of a landscape on the wall, or it could be a window out into the world. You see a still life here as part of this dinner set here, but also it's interesting because it repeats into the decoration, onto the repeating pattern that's on the tablecloth, but it's also on the wallpaper as well. So it's this weird kind of illusion of 2D and three-dimensional space, but it becomes really flattened and decorative. And then where's the portrait? Here's a portrait. So this is something that's both very traditional and something that's very experimental at the same time. I love this painting. It's really interesting. It pays homage to things that come before it, but it's so drastically new. And it's called Harmony in Red, the dessert, because he had originally painted the background and the table a different color, and he kept painting over and over again. Finally, he got frustrated and painted red in desperation over top of it, and finally it did what he wanted it to do, and that is the pure color was able to express the particular mood or emotion that he was going for. In a way, it's real and unreal at the same time. And I lied, because this isn't the last piece I'm going to talk about Matisse. There's also this piece. Remember remember the dance in the background? We can see it teeny tiny right here. He repeats that motif over and over again, and it becomes basically, he's making art about art. He's not making art about an event or a thing or looking out in the real world. He's making art about self-referential, about things that he's already done. But he's really streamlined it and distilled it so that this becomes really decorative and abstract. It's really African and primitive in his opinion, in nature, because of the way that the forms are distorted. You know, if you think about like Egyptian art, for instance, a lot of times, you know, the Egyptian art is 2D and like it's facing one way, but but then the eye is facing a different way, or part of the body, like the legs are facing you, but the torso is turned away. This is a composite view, and you can see that as well in Matisse's work like this. We kind of see the side and the back at the same time. This is something that Picasso does with Cubism as well. So another instance of Matisse kind of exploring these ideas before Picasso has a chance to do it. The last artist that I want to talk about is, and sorry, this got cut off, Constantine Brancusi. And this is, this is Constantine Brancusi, and the name of the sculpture, he's sculpting with marble, is called Sleeping Muse. Muse as in like his inspiration, this female form. And he, for a short period of time, was Auguste Rodin's assistant for a short period of time. But I love this quote. He says that he had to leave Rodin's studio because he was worried about being able to do his own thing. He said, nothing grows under the shade of a great tree. So he had to kind of strike out on his own. And I want to ask you this. So he started with this female form here, and you can see the eyes, the nose, somewhat abstracted, but he then eventually becomes completely abstract. I want you to think about this piece and what your initial impression of it is, as well as this piece as well. What is your impression of these two works being abstract? How do you feel? What does it do for you personally? And I'll pause and let you answer these two pieces. What do you think about his work? So one of the things that Constantine Brancusi said about his work is that he didn't want people to have to explain it. He wasn't worried what it was about. He felt that his work was about pure joy, this pure aesthetic experience. And if it took you somewhere, if it was transcendent, if it took you somewhere, then it was successful. Brancusi said that he would rather people show someone a photograph of his work than to try to write about it or talk about it. So in other words, you can't explain what he's trying to do, and the work isn't necessarily about something. Like this piece, for instance, Bird in Space, 1925 by Constantine Brancusi. Abstraction is brand new. He's one of the first artists to explore abstraction. He said this piece is called Bird in Space, but it's not about a particular bird. It's more about the experience, that fleeting feeling of flight and what it must feel like, the freedom of flight. So this is the essence of a bird flying through space, as opposed to what bird does it look like. If it evokes freedom, if it gives you pure joy. So here is an artist, Constantine Brancusi, who's purely exploring form. Matisse, pure color. Constantine Brancusi, pure form. And what does it do? What does it evoke? Brancusi was constantly arranging and rearranging his works in his studio, taking photographs of them so people all over the world, people in the United States could see him. And that was as good as seeing him in person. He didn't allow other people to take photographs of his work. He was really careful in controlling how they were seen and how they were exhibited. And actually, when he passed away, so this is a Romanian artist that was living in France. When he passed away, he left his entire studio and all of its contents to the French state, the French government. And so now, if you wanted to, you could go to the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris and see his entire studio recreated with a lot of works kind of similar to this. The MoMA, or I'm sorry, the Guggenheim in New York, which was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, also has a beautiful collection of his works. And he didn't just design the sculpture, because typically we'd have a sculpture and we'd put a sculpture on a pedestal, right? And usually the pedestal is just a box. It's just a plain form, and the sculpture sat on top of it. You looked at the sculpture, you ignored the pedestal, but for Brancusi, that was all part of the experience. And so he was exploring form, and so he explored the form of the pedestal as well. So this was this pedestal here that he specifically designed for this marble and stone sculpture to sit on top of, and he repeats that form. He reuses it in other pieces, so it becomes art in and of itself. A pedestal, just like a frame, was something you're supposed to sort of ignore, but here he is elevating the status of just a simple pedestal, and we see it repeating in a piece like this, which he names Endless Column. He wasn't able to do a lot of like massive sculptures or public sculptures. This is one of a rare piece of his that was actually a little bit larger and actually installed in the public. And this is in a village. It's on my bucket list. I've never been. In Romania, near the village where he grew up, and way ahead of his time. He said his work were about pure joy. Just the feeling, the association. It's easy to understand because if you like it, you get it. There isn't some big, long explanation. And he's looking at forms like an Egyptian obelisk, just like the Washington Memorial in Washington, D.C. is a huge obelisk, or in the center of St. Peter's in the Vatican in Rome, there's a big, huge obelisk. This is a really timeless traditional form that we saw first in Egypt, or kind of also like the Tower of Babel. Imagine kind of climbing from the ground to the heavens. And so this endless column could potentially repeat continuously. This is 100-foot tall. It's an amazing piece, and cast iron. So he's using a new material to be able to make work in a way that couldn't have been possible before, and really, really interesting. And he would create variation. So the burden space here is stone and marble, but he also did a polished brass piece as well. He did some of these in other variations. So hopefully this answers that question, and I hope it's added something to the experience as well. Not that you necessarily have to be told how to experience art, but I think in thinking about Brancusi's intentions and what he wanted you to see with his work, that perhaps it gives you a different newfound perspective or appreciation for his work, that it can be easier to understand than you think, or that you can give yourself more credit in terms of being able to interpret art than you might automatically assume. Not all artists do that, but I think it's a great example with Brancusi. So this last chapter talking about pure color with Matisse and pure form with Brancusi. Don't forget, so today's Friday, don't forget by tonight, I would like you to do that artist and media assignment. It's worth 25 points. It's a short paper, 1 to 2 pages. Find a news article or a TV show or a movie that talks about a contemporary artist and how do they portray them? Do they portray them in a positive light, in a negative light? It could be a fictional or an actual person or artist. But how do they treat artists? Do they treat them in a positive way, a negative way, stereotypical way? And I want you to write about the work that they presented and how they presented that artist. I tell you what, let's do this. Today's Friday. Let's say it's due Sunday instead. Does that work? You like that better? I'll give you guys a little bit extra time. Let's keep up with this pace of reading the chapters, watching the lectures, and then doing the 5-point response to it. And don't forget, if you get caught up on something, you can always pause it. And I'm also uploading each of the PDFs that I've showed you today that go along with each of the chapters. They're in the lectures, so you can follow along in those PDFs as well. And I think they'll help you for taking notes, but also for studying eventually for our tests. Peace out. Have a great weekend. All right. See y'all.